I never thought my life would turn out this way. But when survival is on the line, morality becomes a luxury. My name is Elena Carter. I am a wife, a mother of 3, and I have done things I never imagined I was capable of, things that some would call unforgivable. But if they had lived my life, if they had felt the fear I felt, they might understand. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would still call me a monster. A deep breath. A pause. My husband, Nathan Carter, is a good man. He has always been a good man. He worked at the Henderson Granite Factory for years, putting his body through hell to make sure we could afford our tiny home, keep food on the table and send our kids to school. Never complaining. Never once saying I deserve more than this. He accepted our life for what it was, hard, unfair, but still ours. I worked too. Cleaning houses, scrubbing floors, wiping away the messes of people who didn't even see me. People who walked past me like I was part of the furniture. And that was fine. Least it was money. Least it was something. A pause. A voice thick with emotion. But we were always one bad day away from everything falling apart. And then that day came. A long silence. Nathan's accident changed everything. One moment he was strong, moving, alive. The next he was broken. A spinal injury. A shattered femur. He couldn't work. He couldn't even stand. The factory gave us a little money, but it wasn't enough. Not for the surgeries. Not for the endless hospital bills. Not for the home we were about to lose. I was the only one left to hold us together. And I tried. A shift in tone. Defeat creeping in. I tried so hard, waking up before the sun, working longer hours, taking extra houses. But no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. The debt kept piling up. The stress made my husband quiet. I watched him disappear into himself, saw the shame in his eyes every time he looked at me, as if he had failed, as if this was his fault. A beat. We started skipping meals to make sure the kids had enough. I would tell them I wasn't hungry, even when my stomach screamed otherwise. I pretended we were fine. I smiled when I had nothing left to give. But inside I was drowning. And then Damien Vasquez made me an offer. A sharp inhale. Some people will say I could have said no. That I should have said no. Maybe they're right. But the truth is I didn't. I remember the exact moment my life split into before and after. The phone call came in the middle of the afternoon. I was on my knees, scrubbing a marble floor that was so clean you could see your reflection in it. My back ached. My hands were raw from the chemicals. But all I could think about was getting through the day. Then my phone rang. And everything changed. The voice on the other end was rushed, almost frantic. A man from the factory. He kept saying my husband's name. Nathan Carter. Over and over. As if I didn't know who he was talking about. There's been an accident, he said. You need to come. Now. I don't remember getting up. I don't remember grabbing my things or how I managed to get to the hospital. But I remember the smell. That sharp, sterile scent of disinfectant. And something else. Something metallic. Like blood. And fear. I remember the way the nurses looked at me. Their faces tight, their eyes full of something I couldn't understand yet. Then I saw him. A shaky breath. The weight of the moment sinking in. My husband. My strong, hard-working husband was lying in that bed. His body twisted in ways it shouldn't have been. Tubes ran from his arms. A machine beeped steadily beside him. His face was pale. His eyes barely open. I rushed to him, grabbed his hand, but he didn't squeeze back. He just looked at me. And in that moment I knew. I knew our lives would never be the same again. The doctors told me everything in cold, clinical words. A fall at the factory. A shattered femur. A spinal injury that might never heal properly. Surgery was necessary. But there were no guarantees. Recovery will take time, they said. A long time. But they never once mentioned the thing that mattered most. How we were supposed to survive while waiting for that time to pass. A pause. Voice thick with emotion. The factory gave us money. A settlement, they called it. Hush money is what it really was. Enough to keep us quiet. To keep Nathan from filing a lawsuit. First I thought maybe it would be okay. Maybe we could make it work. But the bills piled up faster than I could count. Surgery. Physical therapy. Medication. Rent. Food. And then there were the kids. They needed school supplies. Clothes. A home that wasn't falling apart at the seams. Every time I looked at our bank account, the numbers got smaller, and the weight on my chest got heavier. A deep inhale, like trying to push back tears. I did what I could. I took on more work, more houses, longer hours. My body screamed in protest, but I didn't have the luxury of stopping. Every night I came home exhausted, my clothes smelling like bleach and sweat. And every night I saw the way Nathan looked at me, like he was drowning, like he was watching me carry a burden he should have been carrying himself. He stopped talking as much, stopped looking me in the eye. Some days he barely got out of bed. And the worst part? I understood. I understood his silence, his shame. I understood what it felt like to be powerless. A long pause, the weight of everything settling in. But understanding didn't change reality. And reality was cruel. One by one we started losing things. First, the little luxuries, snacks for the kids, the occasional meal from a restaurant when I was too tired to cook. Then bigger things. The car had problems we couldn't afford to fix, so I walked to work. The electricity was shut off for 3 days because I missed a payment. And then the landlord started reminding us that rent wasn't going to pay itself. Desperation is a strange thing. It makes you see the world differently. It makes you consider options you once thought were unthinkable. It forces you to push past the voice in your head screaming, "This isn't right." Because right and wrong don't matter when your children are hungry, when your husband can't move, when you're standing at the edge of something dark, knowing that if you fall, there's no way back. A sharp inhale, as if bracing for what comes next. That's when Damien Vasquez came into the picture. I had been working for him for a while, cleaning his house, washing his dishes, picking up the pieces of his life while mine was falling apart. He never said much. He was cold, distant, but not cruel. And unlike the other people I worked for, he actually knew my name. When he found out about Nathan's accident, he didn't say much, just nodded. But 2 weeks later he made me an offer. And that was the moment everything truly changed. Damien Vasquez was a man who lived in silence, the kind of silence that felt heavy like a presence in the room. He wasn't unkind, but he wasn't warm either. He never asked unnecessary questions, never pried. He existed in his own world, and I existed in mine, until the day our worlds started to overlap in a way I never saw coming. I had been cleaning his house for almost 2 years. I had seen his life unfold from the shadows. I saw the way his wife, Isla Vasquez, stopped leaving notes for him on the counter. I noticed when her perfume stopped lingering in their bedroom. I knew, before he ever told me, that his marriage was falling apart. You can always tell when a house stops feeling like a home. Then one day she was gone. The closet that once held her designer dresses stood half empty. Their son's toys disappeared from the living room. The framed wedding picture on the mantel vanished overnight. Just like that, Damien was alone. He didn't talk about it. Not at first. But I noticed the changes. He started drinking more. He spent longer hours at work. And when he was home, he barely acknowledged my presence. Before, he would at least nod when I came in. Now he just sat in his chair, staring at the floor, like a man lost in his own mind. A brief pause, like stepping deeper into something dangerous. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because I saw a reflection of myself in him. Two people quietly falling apart. Or maybe because I was exhausted from pretending that I was okay. But one evening, as I wiped down his kitchen counters, I spoke without thinking. My husband got hurt at work. It came out so quietly I wasn't even sure he heard me. But he set down his glass and looked at me for the first time in weeks. Really looked at me. How bad? And just like that, the words spilled out. The hospital. The debt. The way Nathan was slipping further and further into silence, weighed down by the shame of not being able to provide. The way I was suffocating under the weight of it all. I didn't mean to tell him. I didn't expect him to care. But that night Damien listened. And for the first time in a long time I didn't feel invisible. A slow inhale, the moment before everything changes. Days passed. Maybe a week. He didn't mention our conversation again, and I assumed it was over. But then one evening, as I was finishing up in his study, he spoke from behind me. "I want to help you." I turned to face him, confused. His expression was unreadable. But there was something deliberate in his posture. Something careful. He wasn't offering charity. This wasn't a gift. "I'll pay you more." A lot more, he said. He paused. But I need something in return. A sharp exhale as if reliving the moment. I knew what he meant before he even said it. I felt it. In the way the room suddenly felt smaller. In the way his voice dropped just slightly. There was no threat in his words. No force. Just an offer laid out in front of me like an open door. I stood there frozen. My mind screamed at me to say no. To walk away. But instead I asked the one question I wasn't supposed to ask. How much? A moment of silence, heavy and thick. Damien didn't hesitate. He named a number. A number that made my stomach drop. A number that could wipe out months of debt. A number that could buy my children's security. A number that could change everything. And suddenly I wasn't frozen anymore. I was sinking. Sinking into a place where my morals didn't matter as much as my survival. Where my dignity wasn't as important as making sure my kids had a home. Where the weight of Nathan's pain, my pain, our family's suffering, pressed down on me so hard that the idea of taking this offer didn't seem unthinkable. Seemed inevitable. A breath. Shaky. Hesitant. I wanted to feel disgusted. I wanted to feel outraged. But what I felt was relief. And that disenchanted me more than anything. I told him I needed time. He nodded. As if he had expected that. But we both knew the truth. I had already made my decision. That night, I went home and sat beside Nathan's bed. He was asleep, his breathing slow and heavy. I traced my fingers over the calluses on his hands. Hands that had worked themselves to the bone. For us. For me. And I thought about the woman I used to be. The woman who would have never considered something like this. The woman who would have walked away. But that woman had never been this desperate. I closed my eyes and whispered the words I couldn't take back. I'm sorry. The next day, I went back to Damien's house. The day I crossed the line. I moved through the world like a ghost. Felt distant. Muted. The sounds of the city. The weight of my feet against the pavement. The warmth of the sun on my skin. It was all there. But none of it felt real. I walked into Damien's house like I always did. My hands clenched the straps of my worn-out purse. My heart hammering against my ribs. My uniform still smelled like lemon cleaner and soap. Like it always did. But today I wasn't here to clean. A pause. A shaky inhale. He was waiting. Standing near the large window in his bedroom. Already looking out at nothing. He didn't say anything at first. Didn't turn around. And for a brief moment I thought, maybe he changed his mind. Maybe this wasn't happening. Maybe I could still leave. But then finally he spoke. Lock the door. The first time in months we weren't drowning. For the first time I could breathe. And I told myself over and over that this was the right thing to do. A pause. A small laugh, bitter and self-aware. Funny how easy it is to lie to yourself when the lie keeps you from falling apart. Damien never spoke about it. Not the first time. Not the second. Not the 100th. He never asked me how I felt about it. Never made it more than what it was, a transaction. And in some ways I was grateful. Because if he had looked at me like I was anything more than a body in his bed, I might have broken. But then things started to change. A slow inhale. Like stepping into dangerous territory. First it was little things. A question here. A lingering look there. He started asking me about my children. How they were doing. If they needed anything. Do they like to read? He asked once out of nowhere. I had been folding his shirts, my hands moving on autopilot. The question caught me off guard. What? Your kids, he repeated. Do they like books? I hesitated. Yeah, Journey loves them the most. She reads to the boys at night. The next time I came to his house, there was a stack of brand new children's books on the counter, tied together with a ribbon. A pause. A breath caught in the throat. It didn't stop there. One day, I came home to find Nathan sitting up in bed. A brochure in his lap. It was for a small shop space downtown. Where did this come from? I asked, already knowing the answer. Some guy came by earlier. Said his name was Jameson Allen. Said someone wanted to help set me up with a business. He paused, running a thumb over the paper. Said the rent's been covered for the first 6 months. My stomach twisted. I didn't have to ask who sent him. I already knew. Did you tell him no? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Nathan frowned. Why would I? It's a good opportunity. He gave me a long-turned look. Why do you look like you've seen a ghost? A long silence. The weight of everything pressing down. Damien was crossing lines. I hadn't expected this. This wasn't just a deal anymore. He wasn't just giving me money. He was stepping into my life. Helping my children. Helping my husband. And the worst part? I let him. Because the shop meant Nathan could finally work again. It meant he wouldn't have to rely on me anymore. It meant our family had a future. So I swallowed my unease. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That Damien was just a rich man with money to spare. That there was no reason to read into it. But deep down I knew better. A breath uneasy. And slowly he started treating me differently. He stopped being so distant. The way he looked at me changed. Before he was carefully detached. But now it felt different. Like I wasn't just someone in his bed. Like I was something more. He started calling me by my first name instead of just letting my presence go unspoken. He touched me in ways that weren't just about the arrangement. His hand resting on the small of my back as I passed by. His fingers grazing mine when he handed me something. Soft. Intentionally dangerous. And I hated the way it made me feel. Because a part of me liked it. And that was a betrayal in itself. A long pause. Heavy with regret. Nathan noticed. Maybe not the details. But the shift in me. The way I stopped talking as much. The way my mind wandered in conversations. The way I sometimes came home late. Too late. My face unreadable. He never confronted me. Never asked outright. But the silence between us became thick. Suffocated. The love that once lived between us. Replaced with something unspoken. Something fragile. One night as we lay in bed, backs turned to each other. He finally broke the silence. Are you happy? The question hit me like a fist to the gut. I turned my head looking at the ceiling. My throat tightened. Because I didn't know the answer anymore. I was feeding my kids. I was paying our bills. I was saving us. But was I happy? I swallowed hard. Forced a smile he couldn't see. Of course I am. And just like that, the lie became our reality. Secrets don't stay buried forever. No matter how deep you try to push them down, they always find a way to the surface. And mine was rotting me from the inside out. I had convinced myself I could live like this. That as long as I smiled, as long as I pretended, everything would hold together. That I could be two people at once. The mother who made her children breakfast in the morning. The woman who went to another man's bed at night. That I could balance love and betrayal on the same fragile thread. But the weight of it was suffocating. Every time I looked at Nathan, I felt it pressing down on me. The guilt. The shame. The knowledge that if he ever found out, if I ever had to say the words out loud, it would shatter him. And still, I couldn't stop. A long pause. The hesitation thick in the air. I don't know what finally pushed me over the edge. Maybe it was the way Nathan looked at me that morning. Like he knew something. Like he had been knowing for a long time but was too afraid to ask. Maybe it was the way Damien had started looking at me too. Like I wasn't just someone he was paying, but someone he was keeping. Or maybe, I just couldn't carry it anymore. A shaking inhale. The moment before everything crumbles. It was late. The kids were asleep. The house was quiet. But my heart was loud. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his knee, wincing slightly. He had been walking more, spending time at the shop, trying to rebuild the life he lost. And I had been lying to him the entire time. I sat beside him, my hands clenched in my lap. My throat felt tight, like the words were trying to strangle me before I could speak them. Nathan, I need to tell you something. A pause. A breath. His body stiffened. But he didn't look at me. He just nodded. Waiting. I opened my mouth. But nothing came out. My chest tightened. My stomach twisted. And I almost backed out. Almost let the lie keep living. But then somehow, I forced the words out. It's about Damien. A sharp inhale. He turned his head, finally looking at me. His brows drew together. Confusion flickering in his tired eyes. I felt my entire body shaking. My nails dug into my palms. My voice cracked. I swallowed hard and forced it out. I've been sleeping with him. A silence so thick it felt like the world stopped breathing. His face didn't move at first.
No explosión. No rayo.
Just stillness. As if his mind was trying to process what his ears had just heard. But then, it hit. His whole body tensed. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might break. And then suddenly, he was standing, pushing back, creating space between us. Like I was something toxic.